Hi, this is Phil Needham. Today we're looking at combines, specifically Case 9250s, and we're going to be making some comparisons with regards to dual wheels versus different kinds of tracks. We've got a set of Soucy tracks on this 9250, and we've got a set of the newer ATI tracks on the combine in the background. So why would somebody select tracks? Generally, tracks would have about half the PSI on the ground under the front axle compared to tires. And generally in less than ideal conditions, which is more common on larger farming operations, the tracks also have less track depth, less cleat depth, which often results in better emergence, especially in no-till systems. And better emergence should translate into higher yields. The downside of tracks is going to be higher cost, perhaps more maintenance, simply because there's more moving parts. And some of these systems have a lower forward speed on the road. So let's look at each of these systems in more detail. So for all of these three comparisons, we're going to be discussing a Case 9250. We're going to assume it's got a 16-row corn head because a Class 9 machine would often have a 16-row corn head. We're going to assume the grain tank is full of 410 bushels of corn at 56 pounds per bushel. So let's start with these duals. These duals are dual 620, 70, 42 tires. They're Michelin Mega X-Bib tires, and the claim working width from the manufacturer's literature is 25.2 inches. We've calculated the forward-backward distance, or contact patch, to be 32 inches. So that should give us around 806 square inches per tire. There's 4 tires, so that gives you a footprint under the front axle of around 3225 square inches. We're going to assume this combine weighs 78,250 pounds with a full grain tank and a 16-row corn head. We're also going to assume the front axle has around 90% of the weight of the combine. That's obviously going to depend on the corn head and many different factors, but we're going to assume 90%, which I think is reasonable. So if you divide the 90% of the weight on the front axle, that's 70,425 pounds of weight on that front axle. That's a huge amount of weight. If you divide that by the 3225 pounds, PSI equals 20.8. So this tire configuration gives you around 20.8 PSI on the ground. That's still a huge amount. Now, to be fair, a lot of these new radial tires, the VF tires with the flexible tire sidewalls, they're giving us more and more contact patch on the ground all the time with a given tire size, with a given tire pressure. All of these calculations are based on these tires at 35 PSI. That's what the manufacturers suggest with this tire configuration, the number of tires, the weight on each tire. So 35 PSI is our basis for these calculations. And again, radial tires have improved a lot over the past few years. They're better than the radial tires of 10 or 20 years ago, which were obviously better than the bias tires before that. So let's compare these duals to tracks. So this is another 9250. In this example, it's equipped with the Soucy tracks. We've measured these. They're 32 inches wide. They've got an effective front-back footprint of 108 inches. So if you multiply length times width, that's 3,456 square inches under each track. There's 2 of them, so that's 6,912 square inches under the front axle. We're going to assume that this combine, again with a 16-row corn head and a full tank of grain, in this example, we're going to assume it weighs 82,500 pounds. The tracks are going to weigh more. We don't know that exact number. That's just what we're thinking. So if you've got exact numbers, we'd love to have them to include into this document. But if you divide 82,500 pounds and assume 90% of that combine's weight with corn head, and again with full tank of grain, is on that front axle when in operation in the field. That's 72,250 pound on the front axle. Divide that by the track square inches, 6912. That gives you 10.4 psi under each track. And I think that psi would be pretty uniform under the length and width of these tracks. The mid rollers are pretty close together. The tracks are pretty close to the outside of the mid rollers. Some of the early track technology had some big spaces between the mid rollers, and I think there was some peak PSIs. Some of the early tracks, the tracks extended 4 or 6 inches beyond the mid rollers, and they curled up, so you wasn't getting uniform PSI under the track frame. But I think this one would be pretty uniform in this configuration. So this is the third example. These are the ATI tracks, a company that C&H acquired a few years ago. These measure 36 inches wide, so 4 inches wider than the Soucy, but the track frame is shorter and taller, and I think it's got a 90-inch forward to backward footprint. So it's not quite got the footprint that the Soucy tracks has. I think it has 3,240 square inches. 2 tracks gives you 6,480 square inches under the front axle. I think these ATI track frames are slightly heavier than the Soucy one. They look to be. I would love to have exact numbers, especially compared to the duals, but for reasons of comparison, I'm going to assume this combine, again with a loaded grain bin and a 16-row corn head, weighs the same as the combine with the Soucy tracks, which is 82,500 pound. Again, we're going to assume 90% is on the front axle. That's 72,250 again, same as the Soucy combine, and that gives you 11.1 psi under the front tracks. And again, I think the uniformity of psi under this is going to be pretty consistent from a point of view of the spread of the mid rollers, especially towards the outside. So just a basic comparison. You know, tracks are going to be more money. Certain track frames are going to slow the combine speed down on the road, which may be an issue. The Soucy tracks, I believe, do that compared to tires. But this is a lot of basic information for you to consider. Obviously, tracks are more money, but I think there's definitely some benefits to tracks from a point of view of reducing soil compaction at depth to be able to improve crop emergence and yield. So some good information. Again, I would appreciate actual numbers if you've got them. Thanks for watching.